Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right. My name is Megan Hanawalt, and I'm one of the three co-founders of Racial Justice Falmouth, and I'm very happy to welcome you to our inaugural community event. So thank you for being here. I'm going to say a few thank yous, turn the mic over to Barbara, who will introduce Chuck, and then he'll talk for the rest of the evening, or, you know, not the rest, yeah. So I wanted to mention that he brought some of his books for sale. If you are interested in what he has to say, and after the meeting, you could come up here and check them out and possibly buy one or two. I also want to thank the Morse Pond Auditorium, the Falmouth Public Schools and the Morse Pond School in particular for allowing us to have this event here tonight. I want to thank FCTV for recording this conversation. I want to thank the supporters of this event. Community supporters include 8 Cousins Bookstore, the Jewel Cobb Action Coalition, the Falmouth Affirmative Action Committee, No Place for Hate Falmouth, in the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Falmouth Public Schools. And a really sincere, heartfelt thanks to Barbara for arranging this event for us tonight. Barbara's a force of nature on Cape Cod and a lot in Falmouth. She helped or opened the Cape Cod Cape Verdean Museum and Cultural Center in East Falmouth. If you haven't been, you should check it out. It's pretty amazing. And she does a lot of great work here. So thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Chuck and I were remarking what a great audience for a beautiful Monday. I think it's been raining all of our lives, and for you to come in here. We had to send some of this to Cape Verde, Cabo Verde. Welcome, and you can probably already tell why I wanted to welcome Mr. Collins here tonight. I actually met him 2016. I went to my first white privilege conference in Philadelphia, and I heard Leslie was having up in Boston a symposium, a day and a half, and I thought, isn't this interesting? When I went to Philadelphia, the 3-day conference had thousands of people there, and I saw an audience full of BIPOC people, black and brown, more like I had ever seen in my whole life. I actually told the founder, Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., that I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I lived in Taunton almost all my life. My grandmother lived in Harwich here on Cape Cod, and as we know, we were just talking numbers. I worked as a partnership specialist for the Census Bureau, and they say it's like 92% white in Taunton and 93%, and Cape Verdeans don't even come for 0.5%, but we all know not enough people check those boxes, mail it back, and send it in. As a Cape Verdean, I can be honest, half of my people still say they're Portuguese because they came over under the Portuguese flag and colonialism and all of that. So with all of the complexities, Racial Justice Falmouth, the reason that I even asked for this to happen is I said to them, I believe it was March, when they had their monthly book reading review meetings. It wasn't Chuck's book, but I said to them, I had to come here tonight. I usually work to make money for the Museum and Cultural Center, but that night I happened to have it off, and they were reading something very poignant that I started reviewing a few chapters, and I said to them, like you've heard more often than not, I can't breathe. People don't believe the things that Chuck and I and Racial Justice Falmouth talk about happens all the time. People don't believe that we are oppressed to almost death. People don't believe that I really can't breathe sometimes. And when I say to them, someone like a Racial Justice Falmouth, I come here for peace and calm. But what I said was, I cannot just listen and book review. We cannot do this just on Zoom with 8 or 10 or 12 of us. I know you have many wonderful organizations here in Falmouth, but it seems like they're all siloed. We have to pull together. And they said, what would you do? We have to take some action. I am not going to live long enough to see enough change if we don't start taking some serious action. And what would you suggest? Megan said. And I said, I suggest we invite Chuck Collins. Because when I met him in 2016, he had just written the book Born on Third Base, and I said, what an interesting title, and who are you? And he'll tell you who he is. And I said, oh my, he was such a regular person for being a not regular person. And then I said, oh my, and he was friendly and he was kind, and I said, if I had a white privilege symposium on Cape Cod, would you come? And he promised, and he did. My sad part of it was, I thought we'd get 500 people. It was 130. I tried it again in 2022. It was less, 120. I'm not trying that again because people still don't believe me that what is happening to folks like myself and the other folks out here that you know, that we are just, the new word I learned was weathering. You feel like, they used to say, you peel back the onions and you find what's really in the middle. They're peeling back so much of us that we're weathering and dying or just giving up. So maybe with all the folks in this room, we could start some sort of action plan with Chuck as the person who would give us a few ideas, because he looks nothing like me. Maybe you'll hear him better than you've heard me. With that being said, he's become my good friend, and I am just over the moon that he is here, and he always says yes. This is Mr. Chuck Collins.
Thank you, my love. Thank you. That was
Thank
beautiful.
you.
Thank you, Barbara. Barbara's my big sister. Thank you for that. And thank you for coming out on like maybe one of the more beautiful evenings of the summer. And we won't look out the door too much. But, you know, the good news is we're going to have a bunch of beautiful days in the next week. So if you're still trying to get some seeds in the ground or whatever, like we are, we have a couple of good, we have all the way through Memorial Day, I think, is going to be stellar. So thank you for being here. And thanks to Kurt for helping broadcast this to people who can't be here. And thank you, Megan and Sherry and the group from Racial Justice Falmouth for hosting. And also want to shout out to my spouse and my favorite aunt, Debbie Miriam, who lives in T-Ticket, and Mary. But Aunt Debbie is, always our connection in Falmouth, so we're really happy to be here to visit her as well. So I'm curious if anybody saw the Cape Cod Times article that came out over the last couple of days. I was a little, really embarrassed, but that's part of my job, I think, is to sort of put out my story and be embarrassed about it, and then sort of hopefully open up a conversation about how advantage works in our society. For those of you who didn't see that, my great-grandfather was the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, and so bringing home the bacon has a really different meaning in our family. And the reference to being born on third base is, 4 generations later, here we are. And in that book, I tell a story that's very much of a Cape Cod story, which is I'm camping at Nickerson State Park with a whole bunch of families all camped together, maybe Labor Day weekend, or And I get up early before everybody else, and I just like to go on a bike ride. So I get on the rail trail, and it's just a beautiful morning, and I'm feeling good. And I'm thinking I'm just going to go for a 5-mile ride and turn around and come back, 10-mile ride. But at about the 5-mile, 6-mile, I am feeling like I am the strongest cyclist. I'm feeling good. I'm just going to keep going. Mile 10, I'm still going. You know, maybe I should turn around soon. About mile 14, I think, okay, I should just go back. You know, I mean, even though I'm in the buffest shape I have ever been in, I got to get back start cooking breakfast here. I turn around and whoa, about 2 miles into it, I realize I am riding into a wind here, and I'm getting tired, and you know, then I'm thinking, who can I call for a ride? And so, of course, that wind was there all along, that invisible tailwind that propelled me down the Cape. I only didn't notice it when I turned around and started to have to ride into it. And that, you know, you've heard that sort of headwinds, tailwinds metaphor before, but it was real in this case. I literally thought that my forward movement was all about me. And I was pedaling. I wasn't on what I ride now, like an e-bike where I'm going up the hill and there's a throttle and you can, and Mary and I do a lot of biking, and I have to say it's the only time I've ever seen her smile going up a hill is when the throttle is. But, so that notion that we do it on our own, that I was propelling myself, that I was not noticing these invisible forces, to me is really a metaphor for how advantage works, whether it's whiteness or class advantage or other advantages that sort of any of us may be dealt or don't have. That to me is, and that it's very hard to understand the experience of going into a headwind if you don't have that experience. And part of our work as humans is to learn each other's stories, be curious about those forces. And one of the reasons I kind of stand up and I do not have an Oscar Mayer Wiener mobile that I'm driving around in, although I wish I did sometimes. But you know, I'm not going out of my way to, you know, say this is my background. But what I find is that there are a lot of people out there in my circumstances who are kind of in the closet, if you will. They're not talking about their economic advantages, such as they may have them, and it's very hard to have a discussion about inequality in our society if we can't even just tell our stories, whether it's from shame or from embarrassment or whatever. So that's my start. And you know, one thing that I was 24 years old. I had my first real job was organizing tenants in mobile home parks. And as you know, if you live in a mobile home park, you may own your home, but you don't own your land, and you are vulnerable. And mobile homes are not so mobile once you set them up. And in fact, many of these mobile home parks that I was working in were vibrant communities, neighborliness. People had built gazebos, they'd put planted gardens, they'd put skirts around their houses, they built decks. These were permanent structures. So when a new owner comes along and says, oh, I'm going to increase your rent, double your pad space, your rent, people don't have a lot of options. Or we're going to convert this land to residential housing and you all have to move. So those were my early days, was working, and I was in these situations where nobody knew who I was. I was actually the kid with the 24-year-old kid who had terrible skin acne even in my mid-20s, and I would be working with these tenants, and they'd all look at me like, this teenager is going to help us buy our park? We are in more trouble than we thought, And I'm often was in a situation where I was thinking, wow, I mean, these folks, all they need to do is raise $35,000. For them, that was huge. For me, it was like I could literally write a check. It would be no skin, it would wouldn't really affect my life, and it would make a huge difference. And I was getting this dissonance, this crash course in just the harms of inequality. And I wanted to share, because you may not get to, what I would say are a couple of insights I've gotten from having this front row seat to tremendous wealth and advantage. You might hear me say these and be like, well, duh, I'm glad you figured that out. But for me, one is what I would call what we're living through today. So we're living through a period of extreme and extraordinary, and I would say grotesque inequality. That for 40 years, the concentration of wealth and power, the stagnation of wages, that is the main sort of undercurrent of this time we're living in. It started off, I remember in the 80s and 90s, with the wages pulling apart. Real wages for working people were kind of flat or falling. Incomes to the top were going up. The gap between CEO pay and average worker pay went from like 40 to 1 to 400 to 1 over a period of a couple of years. The more recent decades are what I would describe as more, wages have continued to be relatively flat. More and more of the population are what I would call part of the precariat. 70% of the population does not have a sense of economic security and well-being. Not a lot of financial reserves. Some of the, not much to fall back on. More that percentage of that population of all races that feels that precariousness has grown. And in the last 15 years, I think we're moving into a period of like hyper inequality, where the income and wealth gains are not just flowing to the top 1%, you've heard that phrase, the 1%, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. People with wealth, not income, but wealth in the 40 million and up group. That is where almost all the growth of income and wealth has gone in the last 15 years. In the last couple of years, there's been a little bit of rise in, the median wealth and that sort of thing. But so that's the story of our times. And one thing I would describe is, I call it the kind of the new physics of inequality, which is compounding advantage and wealth for people at the top, people who grew up in my circumstances, and compounding disadvantage or barriers for everyone else. That it's hard, that pulling apart has fueled this new physics of inequality. So advantage begets more advantage. Intergenerational advantages become even more pronounced. So that is one just thing that I could talk more about that, and you too probably have seen those signs. The second thing observation, again, from my vantage, is the power of the story of deservedness or meritocracy. That if there was one sort of dominant narrative that justifies these inequalities, and I could have brought a PowerPoint presentation here and showed you all kinds of statistics and data, which you are fortunately not going to have to see. You would beg me to stop, but the picture, the data is extraordinary. But my experience was some people will look at that data and say, well, that's the reason that black median household income is 1/6 white median household income, or the reason that some people's incomes and wealth is so much greater than others is because people who have those high wealth work harder and deserve what they have. And the shadow side of that story is, if you don't have that, if you're economically precarious, you deserve to be where you are. That little phrase, everyone deserves to be where they are, is the dominant story or mythology in our society. And it's awfully hard to dislodge that if that's the lens through which you look at the world. And the thing that's tricky about it is there's this tiny kernel of truth, which is, yeah, what each of us does matter. J. Paul Getty, the oil baron, was once asked, how do you become wealthy? He said, it's really simple. We can do a poll today. Get up early every morning. How many people got up early this morning? Work hard all day. Even if you're retired, you're working a little bit. Right? Number 3, J. Paul Getty says, find oil. But when people look at these stories and statistics about inequality, what they think, many people think is, well, some people get up early. Some people work hard all day. Some people take risks and deserve rewards. That story is so powerful that I have spent the last 20 years of my life figuring out how do we disrupt this narrative of deservedness, to bring some nuance or complexity into it. So we understand, yes, what everyone does matters. Individual choices, behaviors matter. But that the multi-generational natures of advantage, this idea that we live in a meritocracy and we all, even this sort of starting race metaphor is so inadequate, because this whole idea like in each generation we're starting the race anew, and you're going to start, we're all going to start and the gun's going to go off. Wait a second. And my own life is to say multi-generational advantage. What, parents, children, down the line, is like a mighty tailwind. And it is, we've just really begun to unpack just how powerful it is. So the story of deservedness and the power of that and how that kind of holds us back. And one of the things I love to ask people if we were kind of like hanging out and doing a workshop is, okay, what were the forces in your life that, what did you bring? What have you done in your life that's helped move you forward? What qualities do you have? What insights do you have? And what help did you get? And the help could be in the form of your larger extended family. It could be government support for debt-free higher education or a loan. And I could say in my family, even in the non-hot dog side of the family, if you will, people, I have an uncle on my mother's side of the family, working class, who got a farmer's home mortgage after World War II, 1% 40-year mortgage to buy a home in rural Ohio, buy a farm. And that put that family on the train, the wealth-building train, if you will, where subsequent generations were able to get access to land and property, did not have to remain in tenancy and paying landlord. Well, the same programs that helped propel my family were, people of color, Black and African American, some regions Latino and Native folk, were barred from access to those programs. So after World War II, we invested billions and billions of dollars to put white families on the wealth-building train that has had multi-generational payoff. And my African-American brothers and sisters, same age, pretty much same income, but their families were barred from getting on the wealth-building train and remained in tenancy. That's just one of 100 different examples of sort of that multi-generational difference. Third thing that I wanted to just share is there is now a huge industry that helps my family and other wealthy families sequester their wealth, move it away from taxes and accountability so that the rest of you pick up the tab, if you will. And actually, I wrote a book called The Wealth Hoarders, how billionaires pay millions to hide trillions. And it's about what I call the wealth defense industry, the tax attorneys, the wealth managers, the accountants that work with wealthy families. And when I say wealthy in this case, I'm talking about that top 1/10 of 1%, the 40 million and up households who can pay for the special services. Not, many people can maybe afford to have a few sessions with a financial planner and think about retirement, but I'm talking about substantial enabling support to move as much money into the shadows. And the North Star of the wealth defense industry is three things. One, unlimited accumulation, make the pile bigger. Tax minimization, reduce taxes or dodge taxes. And three, dynastic succession, make as much flow down the next generational line along mostly a narrow bloodline. Well, think about that from a racial equity point of view. You have some families who not only have become so wealthy, but now they're investing in wealth defense. They're investing in sort of protecting the pile and keeping and building up, creating trusts that will be paying off generations from now to their heirs, all outside the reach of taxation and accountability. So when you read statistics about inequality, you just remember that's the inequality we know about. There are incredible trillions and trillions. One estimate is $35 trillion globally is hidden in offshore tax shelters, trusts, dynastic trusts, and the like. So that's something I've learned a lot about just by virtue of the trusted family advisors who work with wealthy families, and this is that's what they do. And the final thing I'll just say is the good news, which is there are cracks emerging in the system. There are fascinating cracks. There are people who won the lottery at birth, who've grown up with wealth, who see the harms of these inequalities, don't want to participate in a society where we're just going to keep polarizing and pulling apart, want to be part of reweaving a social fabric, want to rebuild what in the years after World War II, there were elements of the economy that helped us grow together, fueled the racial wealth divide, unfortunately. But there's other things, taxing wealthy folks, investing in debt-free higher education, investing in first-time home buyers, investing in infrastructure that lifted up everybody. So we know something about how to build a shared prosperity economy, and we know we have to do it in a way that doesn't worsen and, in fact, heals the racial wealth divides. Anyway, so there's a network called the Patriotic Millionaires that I helped to co-found, but a couple hundred multimillionaires and billionaires who are publicly out there. Their program is tax the rich, pay the people a living wage, raise the wage floor, and spread the power, reduce the influence of money in politics, and restore our democracy. And there's a whole generation of younger people, and there's financial advisors now who aren't helping rich people hide their money, but in fact figuring out how to redeploy that wealth in a way that helps build a more equitable society and heals the harms caused by the extraction of the wealth. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Anyway, I offer those up just as a couple of insights, if you will, from just getting to be watching this, sort of phenomena of wealthy, dynastically wealthy families. In my case, I'm like the fourth generation in this one family, but there are families that are obviously much wealthier than my family. But the other thing I just wanted to offer a framework for a discussion, and I want to honor what Barbara said, which is, I think you came out tonight not to hear more bad news, but to sort of think, what is it that we can do together? But I want to offer a framework for understanding the moment we're in, which is, I call it billionaire disruption, but you can, maybe someone here come up with a better way to talk about it. But the way what I mean by billionaire disruption is, how has this concentration of wealth, how does it touch each of us? How does it affect our communities? As I described, the last 15 years, just I promise not to belabor you with too many statistics, but 5 years ago, there were 550 billionaires in the United States whose combined wealth was about $3 trillion. Today, there's like 830 billionaires whose combined wealth is $5.5 trillion. What's a trillion? Who knows, right? But what I'm just saying is a small number of people have seen their wealth double in 5 years. During the pandemic, you may recall, the wealth of the top wealthiest folks in the society just took off on a rocket launcher. People benefited from the shuttering of Main Street and the rise of these cloud-based technologies. But that's shocking. And the Rand Corporation did a study that estimates that since 19, let me just get this data right here. Yeah, basically in the last 25 years, the wealth that's been transferred from the bottom 90% to the top 1% is about $50 trillion. So if you're in the bottom 90% and you're wondering where your savings went, or you're wondering where your home equity went, or you're wondering why you can't save, or why things are so much more expensive, there's been a wealth pumping the wealth from the bottom 90% up to the top. I call this the billionaire disruption. And let me talk, if I could try out a couple of examples on you, and you tell me if this helps. But, I would say it pretty much touches everything you care about. So think about your health, your community, the environment, the ecological environment, sense of well-being and democracy, whether we feel like we're cohesive as a society or polarized or on the brink of civil war. The underlying driver of these disruptions are these extreme inequalities. And you hear people say things like, well, we want to get rid of billionaires. And there's a little whiff of exterminism there I don't care for. But what I think we want to rewire our economy to stop funneling so much wealth to the top, and instead spread that wealth out. So housing. Let's just take housing, which is something that obviously touches the Cape, touches our communities. There's always been, kind of gentrification dynamics where people with higher incomes bid up land and housing and make it out of reach for low and middle income people. And the way we addressed that in the 30 years after World War II is we as a society invested a lot in low interest loans for first-time home buyers, building public housing, supporting the creation of rental housing owned by private developers and nonprofits, building lots of elderly housing. We can look around our communities and we can see 60 years of housing policy. But what's happened under this acute billionaire disruption is the problems have been supercharged. So you have a situation now where investors, the pools of concentrated wealth, some of them are called private equity funds, are moving into the housing space to extract even more wealth for that wealth pump to funnel to the top. So you start to see private equity, big investor groups coming, but those are pools of billionaire wealth, or to be specific, people in that top 1/10 of 1%. Wealth held by people with more than $40, $50 million. So now, remember those mobile home parks I was telling you about? We're in a race against these private equity companies that realize these mobile home parks are awesome. These folks have nowhere to go. We can squeeze them harder, and we will. Or guess what the biggest new area for private equity and big pools of investors is in housing is single-family rental houses. So, and this is happening on the Cape, and it's happening all over. The biggest, Apollo and BlackRock and all these big private equity firms are buying up single-family houses and renting them for very high rents. Now, why is that an investor opportunity? Because people like our son, who is 31, who has a higher income than I do, with 2 incomes in their household, still cannot afford to buy a house. They cannot compete in this market against huge investors who pay cash, who waive inspections, and are buying up all these properties. And so the private equity folks have made a calculation. There's going to be a lot of people stuck in rental housing, a lot of higher income households that will be stuck in rental housing and are going to be willing to pay $3,000 or $4,000 to have a house with a yard and their own piece, a sense at least, of a single-family home. So that's the fastest growing area in private equity real estate, single-family home rentals. Now they're getting into second short-term rental. They're putting together large pools of capital to buy up buildings to do short-term rentals and sell those off as REIT investment packages. So my point here is that wealth concentration continues to sort of disrupt because there's more and more efforts to hoover up wealth and income from the current economy. Now, this requires you to get a little bit into your inner billionaire mindset here, which might be a stretch, right? I mean, but think about this. You have $1 billion. Where are you going to invest it? Well, you can't put it all in one place. We all know that. You got to spread it around, right? You can't put all your eggs in one basket. So you're going to have some is in equities and investments, and some is going to be in jewelry and crypto, and some is going to be in art, and you're going to spread your assets around. Well, guess what? Real estate is a great way to spread a lot of assets around. So now our entire country is being, the cost of land and housing is being driven up. If you go to Manhattan, you see the pencil buildings that are rising. The reason they're so thin is because each billionaire is buying a floor so they can have a 360 view. So they have these towers rising. And the problem is they're actually not housing for people to live in. They're just like safe deposit boxes in the sky. Next time you go to Boston and you go to Back Bay, look up at 1 Dalton Place or near Fenway Park. There's like whole rows of these buildings. They are swanctuaries, I call them. They're like places where people are parking huge amounts of wealth, not to live in, but just to hold the value. And that's the billionaire mindset now is, yeah, we want to have some of our money over here working and extracting and getting high returns from the rest of the housing economy in this case. And we also just need to park our assets in a way that, so they can hold their value. That's just one example in the area of housing, and I could go on, but what's the solution? Well, a lot of communities are saying, how do we nail down as much land and housing as possible, create community land trusts for affordable housing, nonprofit housing organizations, taxing luxury real estate transfer taxes, which we know in Nantucket and in Boston, we're petitioning the state legislature for the home rule petition to allow luxury transfer taxes that could go into a housing trust fund that could fund permanently affordable housing, take more housing out of the speculative market for people to live in. There's a whole menu of things we can do to discourage the speculation, to tax the harms, and use whatever revenue comes from that to invest in things that will fix the housing economy. So, billionaire disruption. the racial wealth divide. Here, we already have a 400-year legacy of racism in the distribution of our wealth. Talk about a multi-generational story right up to the moment we're living in. You know, one statistic that I like to think about is how financial reserves, how many people have 3 months or less of financial reserves to fall back on. And I don't have that exact statistic in front of me, but I know that for white households, it's like 50% have 3 months or less. And when you look at it through the lens of race, though, it's like 75, 80% of African American households, 3 months or less. So there's an example where the racial wealth divide shows up in people's bank accounts, sense of well-being, sense of cushion. That is a function of a multi-generational legacy of racism in wealth building. You know, I mentioned after World War II and just home ownership, but take other forms of asset building. So I think one of the things that's happened is that the billionaire disruption, this concentration of wealth, which is really the last 40 years when it's really started to take off, is supercharging the existing racial wealth divide. It's leading to more of a pulling apart when it comes to wealth and savings, and that physics of accumulating advantage and accumulating disadvantage. One thing that makes it tricky and why politically it's challenging to talk about things like repair and reparations is there's a lot of white households who also have lost ground, have lost sort of a sense of security, and who are saying, hey, you know, if you're going to have a program that's targeted around the 400-year legacy of racism and wealth building, don't forget about me over here, who's also losing ground. And that's where I think there's a both and, which is we need to address the last 40 years of extreme inequality and people who are being left behind, and address the 400-year legacy of race and racism in complementary ways. And again, back to housing. Yeah, there's a lot of young people. Why don't we have a 40-year, 1% first-time homebuyer program for people who have no access to family assets? And then why don't we also look at some form of repair that looks at the role of racism in blocking access to wealth building? You know, we can do both those things. And it could be paid for by taxes on these extreme concentrations of wealth, which are harming everyone, even those at the top. And feel free to ask about any specifics on some of these things. Our democracy, well, you know, the billionaire disruption is disenfranchising us. It's taking away your vote. You know, the candidates that stand for office have already passed through the wealth primary. The wealthy donors have already weaned the field and are presenting the candidates, for the most part, who will stand for election. Healthcare. If anybody's been to an emergency room lately, I hope you haven't, but if you have, you're starting to see that if it's a for-profit hospital, the private equity investor pools are there, and they are looking for cost-cutting opportunities and wealth extraction opportunities. It's affecting our health and well-being. The environment. To the extent we're paying attention to the amount of emissions and sort of climate disruption, and Mary and I live in Vermont, but you know, we last summer we had deluge, floods, smoke from Canadian wildfires. I don't need to tell you, you had some of the same experiences here. We're heading into a disrupted future. And yet, the biggest emitters are the wealthy, the billionaire, the 30 million and up, the private jet, large house, large vehicle, a standard of living whose emissions are 50 to 100 times greater than most ordinary households in the United States. There are huge proposals to expand all the little airports around Cape Cod and the islands, and the biggest private jet airport in New England is outside Boston, Hanscom Field. There's a private developer there that is working to triple the number of hangars for private jets. Turns out, I did not know this, there's a serious problem of unhoused, unsheltered private jets in New England. I hope you'll sign and contribute some money toward this struggle. Where do you park your private jet? And, and most billionaires have 2 or 3. Where do you park them? So there's a proposal to triple the private jet capacity of Hanscom Field, and I'm very involved in that because, if private jets are probably the least defensible form of luxury consumption on a warming planet. It's like, and yet, these folks are powerful. They are used to getting their way. The private jet lobby and the aviation lobby together are pushing Governor Healy to approve, Massport to approve expansions of all these private jet facilities. Oh, and by the way, they'd like you to keep subsidizing that. Even if you've never gotten on a plane, you're subsidizing these private jets. They only, private aviation's about 16% of all plane travel, but they only chip in about 2% of the cost of running the air system, including all the airports that don't even have commercial travel. So that's the other part of this billionaire dynamic. We keep, not only are we harmed, but we have to subsidize these extraordinary concentrations of wealth and power. I promise I'll stop with some of the, but the nonprofit sector, I'm curious, how many people have in their lifetime or presently have worked in the nonprofit sector, either as an employee or as a trustee, board member of some group? I mean, the nonprofit independent sectors, 10% of our economy, 12% of jobs. It's a vibrant independent sector. But the philanthropy arm that supports that sector is again being disrupted by concentrated wealth and the billionaire disruption. Even 10 years ago, $4 of every individual gift to charity went to a private foundation or a donor advised fund. Today, 41% of every donation goes to a private foundation or a donor advised fund. Some of that money continues to flow out, but there's been a huge warehousing of charitable dollars. There's about $1.7 trillion sitting in private foundations, donor advised funds. Most people, when they give to charity, will give directly to the Cape Verdean Museum or to the Boys and Girls Club or whatever the organization. They give directly to the working charity. The wealthier the donor, the more they give to an intermediary that they control, and then they get an immediate tax reduction, and then that money trickles out. So even philanthropy now has been kind of warped and distorted by this growing concentration of wealth. And there's a whole effort to reform that, and you can check out donorrevolt.org. And I guess maybe the final thing I'll just say is the billionaire disruption is costing you. It's costing you in terms of the fact that wealthy people have figured out how to game the tax code so severely that it effectively shifts taxes off the wealthy onto everyone else. Or budget cuts. So we're heading into a period of austerity. There's not enough money. Where's the money going to come from? But part of it's that $35 trillion globally that's in the shadows. Part of it's that the progressive elements of the tax code are weakening, I came from Vermont. We live in Vermont now. My U.S. senator, I'll do a little imitation. He says, "Under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower," that's a joke. "Under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, the wealthiest 1% paid over 90% of their incomes above a certain threshold, and we made investments that expanded the middle class. Debt-free college, affordable housing, all that." And that was the case. We have seen taxes on the top go to almost their lowest levels in 4 decades. So that's one takeaway. We have to look at who pays taxes, how, and understand the tax obligations are being shifted onto everyone else. Let me close and open up for discussion and hear thoughts, reflections from you all. But my invitation in terms of how do we fix this is first, think about the cultural stories of deservedness. Think about how do we talk about meritocracy and starting gate equality and some of these, I think, mythological terms. How do we tell stories about advantage and deservedness? How do we understand that our political system has somewhat been captured by big money? When we think about the racial wealth divide, how do we, I would invite my people who come from my kind of a white European heritage to look at how multi-generational advantage has helped. There may be things that have held us back, but look at the ways the invisible wind, the multi-generational forces have maybe helped us. Yes, each of you have done things individually that make a difference, but really try to unpack that story and share did you get help along the way? My partner Mary has worked in housing over the years. She says nobody that she knows is buying a house, nobody under 40 is buying a house without family help. Well, again, think about how that reinforces and compounds the racial wealth divide. If your parents didn't own a home, chances are you're not going to own a home. And so, did you get the parental down payment assistance program? If so, tell people that. Demystify that. So yeah, the only way I could have bought this house when I got the GI Bill, or I got a Veterans Administration mortgage, or my parents helped me. There's a sort of shame and secret around that. But part of how we're going to break open these dynamics is to talk about how those accumulated advantages work. Tax the wealth. In Massachusetts, a year ago, we voted to add a new top tax rate, and for transportation and education, it passed. I was the field director in 1994 when it lost for the 4th time, and it took another generation, and lo and behold, it raised $1.5 billion of additional revenue, and we're not having to make some of the budget cuts at the state level because of that. So here, as the Commonwealth, we said wealthy people can pay a little bit more. It didn't lead to a collapse in the economy. It didn't lead millions of people to, hundreds of people to flee the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. People who were going to go to Florida were already going to go to Florida, and it's made for a stronger Commonwealth. So need to, even though taxes can seem boring, it's really, really important to talk about. We still have a wage floor that is extremely low, and many, many people working poverty wages and working multiple jobs. We need to look at, how we can lift that wage floor, how we can support small businesses to be able to do that. Need to pay attention to the concentration of wealth and how it's distorting our democracy and the harms there. So let Let me just close with an invitation to check out the work that we do. You know, my day job is I'm at the Institute for Policy Studies. I co-edit a website called inequality.org. Every day we're putting up articles. Every week we send out a newsletter of how people are engaged, what they can do. But let me stop there, partly because I want to just open up and hear questions, thoughts, comments, and I'll try to facilitate that unless, Megan, you wanted to, but...
I mean, I can hand them the microphone work for audience members.
Do whatever you need to do. I'll try to also repeat. I'll try to repeat.
It's a little difficult to pass around.
Oh, so people can come up and.
Whatever you need to do.
Or I'll also try to summarize or repeat questions. Yes, this gentleman here.
You mentioned that there's an organization and there's people like you that are trying to actually do hard work toward reducing inequality. What's the name of that organization?
Well, within sort of, there's a group called the Patriotic Millionaires. Okay, sorry, thank you. This is a recording mic, so, but I'll try to, the question was, you know, I mentioned an organization that's working to address these, and I was specifically talking about, you know, people, higher income, high wealth folks who are speaking out about the dangers of inequality. So there's a network called the Patriotic Millionaires, and you know they're advocating for fair tax policies, elimination of some of these trusts and loopholes that the wealthy use. They also, some of them voluntarily pay more taxes, particularly at the state and local level. But they're saying, you look, the rules of the tax code. It's one, you know, it's like you can't really organize a river cleanup and say, oh, everybody voluntarily pick up your litter. We need to have sort of rules. Well, tax policy is how we make rules about how we pay for things together. So, Patriotic Millionaires is one of those groups.
And do they have a PR agency?
They're pretty well known. So if you actually look, there's like, you know, probably 4,000 major media stories a year about their work. And there's a global arm of that. So yeah, check out Patriotic Millionaires. There's also a group of younger people called Resource Generation, people under 35, who some are entrepreneurial wealth, some are inherited wealth, but they're really leading the way in sort of thinking about how to build an equitable society among their peers. So yeah.
The Falmouth town meeting in April approved a real estate transfer fee, and the home rule petition will be on its way shortly to the General Assembly. That's the good news. I don't want to get ahead of you, but you're going to have to repeat things.
Oh, okay, so this gentleman's talking about the April town meeting approved a real estate transfer tax that's on its way to Beacon Hill I'll add to languish. Yeah. Right.
Bad news is, while the governor has requested general authority for all municipalities, the Speaker of the House said the other day he doesn't think they have enough votes in the House to pass it. This is in the People's Republic of Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing, having personally grown up in the Midwest, where if a town wants to tax itself and the citizens all agree that then they can do that. Whereas in Massachusetts, the citizens of Falmouth and the citizens of Boston and Nantucket can petition for a home rule to tax themselves, and the legislator from Ludlow can vote against it. So there's a structural problem here. From a Boston point of view, we're like, look, we're holding 40% of the affordable housing in eastern Massachusetts in this city. If the people of Boston say they want to tax luxury transfer taxes, give us that home rule power. And so yeah, it's a statewide organizing issue, and I'm not sure, there's a simple answer except, what unfortunately happens in that situation is, the powerful developer lobby, the real estate lobby, of which my family is part of. So I get the emails and see how get those action alerts, stop the bad policy. They figured out, you just have to buy off the speaker and this committee chair and this person, and pretty much you can gum up the works. So demanding, those of you who have friends in other parts of the state say, stop holding up these home rule petitions. We probably need to change the state charter at some point so that communities have more local control when it comes to those things. But I would keep the pressure on. I actually think it's a really important solution. We saw what happened when they passed the Affordable Communities Act or whatever. It was a legislation that gave communities the ability to levy a transfer tax or a real estate tax that could go toward certain community needs. To have something specifically about housing would make a difference. In Vermont, for 34 years now, we have had a real estate transfer tax that goes into something called the Housing Conservation Trust Fund. The money's used for land conservation and permanently affordable housing that will not go back on the speculative market. And that's just a really good idea. And then you can add on top of that transfers over $2 million, or in the case of Boston, very high luxury transfers. And a bunch of cities around and states have those around the country now, and they're raising substantial money, and they're able to address their local housing problems. So continuing to kind of keep the pressure on the rest of the state legislature. And if every representative goes into the Speaker of the House and says, I have 3 priorities, and one of them is this, that will have an impact. Yeah.
Yeah, can I comment a little bit about something that's going on that people might be interested in?
Can you go to
There is something called the Unconvention that is going to be happening January 2nd, and not June 2nd. And this is sponsored by something called Mass Progressive Action Organization Committee. They're going to have one speaker, Robert Leitner, who wrote an article called Massachusetts Blues, which is about how non-progressive Massachusetts is actually. And the other speaker is Danielle Allen, who is involved with Partners in Democracy. And they are going to be talking about how an organizational structure can be set up within Massachusetts that will start really looking at progressive issues and helping us deal with this mythology that Massachusetts is so liberal. All you need to know is our beach access is the most progressive in the country. So that tells you something about who's really in charge. But that's going to be, if you look up the Unconvention, you can get the information about that. It's a Zoom meeting. There's no
Thank
money
you.
involved.
That's for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, the
Thank
others
you,
can
Kurt.
use it as well.
Yeah, if anybody wants to. But so June 2nd, the Unconvention. Right here, yeah. Other thoughts, questions, reactions? Actually, let's hear from somebody, Megan, who
Well,
has.
I was gonna say, I have 2 questions and a comment, so you can take them as you want. But one question is on the foundations and their ability to hide wealth, like move money out of the.
Let's let everybody hear it once.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to hear what you're saying.
So my first question is about foundations and their ability to hide money. I guess that's for the wealthy, they get the immediate tax benefit, but foundations they only have to pay out 5% a year. Can you talk about that a little, please?
Sure. Yeah, so we have, really since 1969, we've had a legal framework where people can give to charitable tax-exempt organizations or foundations and get a tax reduction. And that law says, you get a tax reduction in exchange for surrendering dominion and control over your money. But what's happening is philanthropy is changing. How we support the independent sector is changing. It used to be, if you think about the United Way or the Red Cross or March of Dimes. There were all these organizations that were broadly supported. Lots of small donors, low and middle income donors support. What's happened is most of the growth in giving now is very high income givers. And wealthy people give differently than everyone else they give differently where they give their money, but they also give primarily through intermediaries that they control, private foundations and this new emerging donor advised fund movement. So yeah, if I give money to a foundation, I can reduce my taxes. That foundation then is obligated to pay out 5% of its assets every year, but it can include overhead and it can include donations to my donor advised fund. And a donor advised fund is a giving account usually at a sponsoring organization. Could be a community foundation, could be Fidelity Charitable. Donor advised funds, you put money into it, you immediately get a tax reduction, but there is no payout requirement. So what we're seeing is kind of a bottleneck or a warehousing, or in the case of donor advised funds, kind of a mismatch between the incentive to give money and the incentive to ultimately move it to a working charity. So yeah, I could drone on about this topic, but I think that the Congress needs to act to encourage the flow, to make sure the money doesn't sort of sit for decades, that if somebody gets a tax break, then the money should move in a timely way to the working charities. And unfortunately, this is where the billionaire disruption has come in. The financial advisors the same guys, if you will, who advise wealthy people on how to create tax dodges and tax loopholes are also encouraging people to put their money into donor advised funds because you get a tax break immediately, you don't have to give it away, you can keep investing it, you don't have to tell anybody what you're doing with the money, there's no transparency, and you can give complicated assets anyway, so that they're being more marketed as tax reduction vehicles than giving vehicles. And that's not to say, a lot of people have donor advised funds and money goes in and money goes out, the revolving door, but that's not mandated, that's not required. So anyway, there's a way in which I think we can act to incentivize people to move the money in a more timely way. So we have actually, if you go to donorrevolt.com, you'll see a campaign of donors to DAFs and foundations speaking out in support of changing these laws. And if you don't have a private foundation or a donor advised fund, you can go to stophoarding.org and urge lawmakers to fix this system that's now being kind of hijacked and abused. In the end, philanthropy are our tax dollars at work. The wealthier the donor, the bigger the tax reduction. So for every dollar a billionaire gives to their charity, their charitable foundation, they get 73 cents of tax breaks. Effectively, the rest of us subsidize 73 cents of that dollar donated. So we have a public interest in knowing what's going on with that money. And we should require that it move in a timely way and that we should know where it goes. So payout, increase the payout, require a payout, require transparency, and crack down on some of the financial industry abuses in that space. But did you have another thing, Megan, you want to know? Here, I'll make it a little easier.
Two comments. One. Two comments. One, the
Did it get switched off?
No, I think it's just one of those, you got to kind of eat the microphone, as they say.
two comments. First, the candidate for president, who the media has been suggesting is the odds-on favorite, just promised a room full of billionaires that if they give him $1 billion for the campaign, he'll be sure to cut their taxes and they'll get their money back in no time. We're not going to have any tax increases in Congress, unfortunately. The last tax increase of consequence was in the 1990s during the Clinton administration. It's just not going to happen. I mean, I'm with you on that proposition, but I don't think that's it. But the second thing is to add to your setup piece, because you're apparently doing these talks, and you're to be honored for doing this, is that Medicare and Social Security trust funds are in trouble. And they're going to run out here late 1920s and into the 2020s and the 2030s. Those two entitlement programs are major support structures for middle and low-income people in this country. So putting aside the tax thing for just a minute, it seems to me that that's one of the areas where we need to concentrate and to make sure that the funding apparatus, the rules of the game for those two funds don't get changed fundamentally, because they have eliminated huge amounts of poverty in this country. Not all of it by any means, but so I encourage you to add that. It's not just on the tax side, it's also on the spending side. And those two sources particularly are, it seems to me, important to this long-term discussion we're having.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting is 2 years ago, the U.S. Congress almost passed something called Build Back Better. It was going to be a $4 trillion legislation that would have actually created a new child care system in the United States, that would have addressed infrastructure and helping transition to a kind of post-carbon economy, all kinds of really long overdue public investments, shoring up, the retirement programs. It was $4 trillion investment over 10 years, paid for entirely by taxes on households with mostly incomes over $1 million, none with incomes below $400,000. It came within 2 votes of passing in the U.S. Senate. 2 Democratic senators, Manchin and Sinema, cut a deal, and the whole thing was shrunk down to a third of its original. But interesting how close that was. So I think on the one hand that's discouraging. On the other hand, as people in Congress tell me, they still have the muscle memory of that. There's a lot of scenarios. Who know? I'm not going to venture what's going to happen in the next 6 months. But one scenario is there's a positive scenario, which is we may actually have another window where something like a Build Back Better investment package could move forward. One thing that's fascinating is proposals to tax the very wealthy are extraordinarily popular, cross party lines. Republicans, Democrats, Independents all know, coming out of the pandemic especially, how the wealthiest people in our society have gamed the tax code. And people understand there's huge pressure. The reason the current president has said, we should have a billionaire tax is because that polls well. I mean, it's really, really popular. So there is this groundswell of pressure building for restoring the progressivity. And I say restoring because, for 40 years after World War II, we had a very progressive tax system. We taxed the wealthy, and then we invested in things that created opportunity for everyone else. And we can do it in a way that also, I think we could narrow the racial wealth divide in a generation. You could have baby bonds, every child born gets a sort of like little bit of account in their name. Proactive, reparative home ownership access, first-generation homebuyer programs. There's a bunch of really interesting reparation and repair proposals at local, state, and federal levels. We could totally shift this trajectory. So my own sunny disposition has been hammered a lot in the last 2 years, but I actually think one thing is to continue to say it's possible. The public will is there. Yeah, there's very loud critical voices, but for instance, taxing the wealthy and investing in debt-free college, addressing our housing crisis, enabling people to retire with dignity in health care, closing the multi-generational racial inequity, racial wealth divide. Those are actually popular winning ideas. We have a political system that's been captured, and these proposals are blocked. I actually think we're going to stop this private jet expansion outside at Hanscom Field, which is Concord, Lexington. That is going to be the first global stoppage of a private jet expansion for climate reasons. That's there's a lot of discouraging news, but I actually think we need to we all have some work to do in the coming months ahead to kind of reweave our social fabric, find points of unity with our neighbors, push forward on some of these things. But I actually think there is a possibility we could turn the corner. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't know if you will
Maybe speak to everybody.
Yeah, well, I'm going to stay here.
Yeah, stay there.
Easier to stay here. But I suspect if most people would agree with the fundamental thesis of what you've mentioned tonight in terms of what's happening to a lot of folks, the inability to buy a home, all of the issues affecting the middle and lower income classes today. What they don't understand is how the assets have traveled to what you suggest is levels where it's in the hands of smaller and smaller numbers of people. They don't quite get how that has happened. They know it's happening. And to the extent people try to suggest, well, there's these reasons, it's awful easy to label those sorts of commentaries as you're seeking socialism. You're trying to develop a philosophy that takes away from people who've earned it. That's, I think, one of the frustrating things that is at the heart of what you've spoken about tonight. Would you agree or disagree?
People able to hear what he said? Okay, yeah. Well, I would just say amen to I think people are getting this picture. And actually, I think the pandemic deepened our understanding of the harms to the society of this continued pull apart. And I think there's actually affluent and wealthy people, and I'm kind of tracking and watching this, who understand that this is not going to end well if we keep going on this trajectory. If we keep deepening the ruts of persistent poverty and inequality, if we keep seeing more wealth concentrate in few hands, it's going to lead to all sort of societal breakdown. So I think talking about the mechanism, the wealth pump, and whatever people's view is, if you, like I say, if you care about healthy market economy, if you care about capitalism in its healthiest form, you should be really concerned about how these inequalities distort our economy. I mean, we haven't really had robust antitrust policies. We're seeing huge consolidations of corporations. That's a tax on us because our costs are going to go up. If you only have one cable provider and 3 cell phone companies, that's a tax on us because they have monopoly power. And I agree. Yeah, we've been well schooled to not think beyond a certain point. We could agree on all these harms, but then when it comes to the solution, you can't tax the wealthy. Well, even there, 85% of the population now supports these tax the wealthy proposals as a way to save democracy and restore healthy capitalism, let alone make public investments that make the lives of non-rich people better. you know? So yeah, I think we have to come back to just, you know, unpacking that reflexive, biased, oh, we can't think this way, we can't go down this path. I mean, you know, the American dream, if you are not rich, but you want the American dream, let's define that. You want to retire before you die. You want to have access to health care. You want your children to have a decent life. You want to own your own home. That's not such an extreme set of requests, right? The American dream, you want opportunity. You're better off in Canada than you are in the US. Because Canada will invest, or the Nordic countries, or a lot of other places. And that sounds un-American to say that, but actually we haven't had the levels of social mobility that existed after World War II for several decades. We've become, you know, a class, caste, race caste society. We have always been, but it's getting more intense, entrenched. So, you know, why did the American dream isn't here is because Canada invests in opportunity. You know, if you're not born wealthy, you're better off growing up in Canada. That's where you can find the American dream now. So we need to talk to our neighbors about that, because and most people know that. And if you have any children in their 20s or 30s and you're watching them try to make it in today's society, you absolutely know that things have changed.
So my friend Chuck, here's the plug, and this is not to end it, this is to see what we can do to get to the point, I don't know why this is or isn't, to get to the point where we can make some actionable items reality, possibly before we leave here today. Was anybody able to read Chuck's book? This is not like to shame anybody. The person that was asking about the patriotic millionaires. So I started reading this book 7 years ago. And I restarted, and I restarted, and I restarted. The forward, it was 2016 when Chuck did this. This is what always obviously caught me all off guard. That millionaires would actually talk about themselves in this way. I am part of the group that is supposed to learn from Chuck Collins's Born on Third Base, the 1%. I have a pretty good life. I retired from the financial services industry at the age of 54. I am now the chairperson of the Patriotic Millionaires, a group of wealthy Americans trying to make the point that the policies that create gross inequality in our society are not good for regular Americans. I'll skip forward. Did I work especially hard? There's where Chuck started. Maybe a little, sometimes. Most of my work involved sitting in an office reading and writing emails and talking on the telephone. Did I work harder than the guy who had who had to connect the hoses to the fire hydrant in the snow, or the woman who had to smile while schlepping pitchers of beer around all night? Not really. Was I lucky? You could call it luck, but it wasn't like everyone bought a lottery ticket and my number happened to come up. Who was saying all of this? It ends, Born on Third Base speaks to the non-wealthy too, showing them how by working together we can begin to reconstruct truly equitable communities, peace by resilient peace. Rarely do startling new insights and prescriptions for change come wrapped in such a winning trio of great storytelling, careful scholarship, and a compassionate voice for both sides of the divide. If you think you know all there is to know about the nation's gripping inequality crisis, you don't. There are more than a few surprises in the pages ahead. And this was written by Morris Pearl, chairperson of the Patriotic Millionaires. And of course, he was a former managing director of BlackRock Incorporated. Okay?
He's a good guy.
So Chuck wouldn't have to say this. If you haven't read it again, I keep rereading and rereading and rereading. But mostly I go back to, so they're admitting this, Chuck. We're all admitting that this is true and it can happen. But this was 2016, and I seem to feel like not only has it not happened, the gap is increasing, as you know. How do we stop that gap and move backward?
I mean, I think the good news is the pressure is building for a realignment. It could still go the wrong direction, but I actually think the fact that you're here, that you talk to our neighbors, I think the pressure is building. Nathan, you have and then maybe we have two more questions. Nathan and this one,
Thank you for this, and particularly the insights around the wealth pump. Honestly, I would call it the billionaire ripoff. I think that's probably a better term. And I think we really need to shape the conversation around that and recognize that that's going on, and we need to shut it down. Like, there's no question, it needs to be shut down. It's not healthy for anyone, and we gotta break it. And the big challenge I see is what you alluded to a few times, which is essentially the capturing of our government system, where we really have no ability to pass really meaningful legislation to address these issues. And I vacillate between the optimism that you describe and some serious pessimism that this is not gonna not end well, and it's really going to be violent and horrible if we let it get that far. My biggest question is, because there's part of me that alternates between despair in listening to what you say and sort of little shreds of hope. And I feel like the wealthy have a really clear plan of what they're going to do. And I don't feel like the rest of us have a plan. And it's not like we're not smart. It's not like we're not able to create such a plan. And how do we do that? How do we break down these problems? How do we overcome?
Thank you. I think just continuing to, I mean, I kind of offered that up, the billionaire ripoff or the billionaire disruption, or how these inequalities really touch and undermine each of us as a starting point for going forward and engaging. Because, you know, it's like you can't solve a problem unless you can name it, and unless you have a framework to understand it. And I think that is, we are living in this, you know, billionaire hijacking of our society and institutions. It's not like we didn't have problems 40 years ago, and you know, we have this 400-year-old, you know, racial wealth divide, but this is like the last 15 years. I think there's like the wealth pump is like moving faster. So it's like we need to have like a societal intervention in that. And I actually think, you know, if you're sitting at home individually, you're not part of a group, one of the most important things is to find a few others, you know. Racial Justice Falmouth is a group. There's indivisible chapters around the country. There are organizations in this room that need people, where we can come together face to face and sort of build a countervailing power. And actually, I think that I think there's a crack within the wealth holding classes, cracks opening up, because maybe it's this late stage capitalism phenomena, but the beneficiaries of the system are starting to see the harms themselves and are, moving in a different direction. But the impetus is going to come from you all, from ordinary people pushing back and saying, we want our democracy back. We want John Kenneth Galbraith said, he described this sort of where we're heading as private luxury and public squalor. And every time I go somewhere where it's like, this is a beautiful elementary school, and I'm sure that people fight every day to make this school as great as it seems to be. And yet, you go to these insurance buildings in these towers in downtown Boston, private luxury and public disinvestment. And it doesn't have to be that way. And that's the other chorus that I would just say. It doesn't have to be this way if we organize to push back. And so that, I think, check out inequality.org, join the groups that co-hosted this event, find one or two other neighbors where you can sit together and say, okay, what am I called to do in this moment? The next couple of months are really vital times in our democracy. We live in Massachusetts, so maybe we don't feel like we have much say over some of the national events. There's only 7 or 8 states, it seems, that presidential elections matter. But actually, there's lots and lots of ways that we can each sort of plug in and bring our gifts to this moment we're in. So find others. Don't be isolated. Find a small group, a posse, a group, the existing group, or form one to sort of support one another to take action. I think that in some ways one of the most important things. And there's, if you have money and you want to donate to politics, there's networks to do that. If you have the month of October and you have friends in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Georgia or Arizona, it's nice to go to Arizona in October, there's volunteer opportunities, to sort of help not just address the national, but what's happening in a lot of states, Wisconsin, Michigan. So actually there was a woman here I wanted to make sure.
So in the other books by Chuck, it says that also Chuck wrote a book with Bill Gates Sr., Wealth in Our Commonwealth, Why America Should Tax Accumulated Fortune. So we're talking about other real important people are really trying to get things done. Who else?
No, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity, but I think Nate summed it up very nicely.
Yeah.
It was so eloquent, I couldn't say more, except that I very much appreciate your optimism.
Thank you.
Well, appreciate your optimism. You mentioned if I was doing a workshop, if we're going to move forward with this, what kind of workshops do you do, Chuck? Or what could you suggest that we do here?
Well, not necessarily even me. I think the work that Racial Justice Falmouth, having conversations about how do we talk to our neighbors, how do we tell our own story through the lens of what help did we get, how do we sort of support people who are working for racial justice on the Cape. I think the housing area is obviously something that touches everybody, from people who are unsheltered, people paying half their income in rental housing, folks who should be in a situation where they can own their own home, but it's completely out of reach. That touches so many people. I think that's a manifestation of inequality, and to sort of bring bigger system solutions to that problem here on the Cape is a great example. But yeah, let's close, and I thank you for coming out, and there's a little bit of twilight out there, and enjoy the evening. Yeah, thank you. And please check out some of these books, and happy if you know somebody who wasn't here and you want to give them a book, I'm happy to sign it to them.